Chosen one, why do they panic when you finally stop apologizing for breathing? Why does your silence now sound like thunder to ears that once demanded your whispers? And why, tell me, why are the same people who told you to disappear now terrified that you're no longer hiding in plain sight? Listen to me, chosen one. The most dangerous person in the room is not the loudest. It's the one who returned from hell, glowing without needing applause. They tried to erase you in rooms you were never invited to. You were exiled, mislabeled, misused, cast out like yesterday's news, dismissed like background noise. They wrote your obituary while you were still breathing, carved your epitaph while your heart was still beating. You've carried betrayals like bricks in your bones, each one adding weight to shoulders that were never meant to bear their shame. And somehow you're still standing. This message is for those who were told to dim their light so others could shine. For those who were made to feel like the problem when you were the only truth in the room. You know who you are. You're the one who stayed quiet while they rewrote history, the one who smiled through the sabotage, who carried their secrets like stones in your chest. You're the one who was punished for having standards, criticized for having boundaries, condemned for having a backbone. They needed you small. They required you to be silent. They demanded you be broken. But here's what they never saw coming. Your breaking was actually your breakthrough. Your exile was your elevation. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. You weren't disappearing. You were downloading. You weren't hiding. You were healing in a dimension they couldn't access. The room got quiet when you stopped shrinking because your presence now carries the weight of someone who survived what was meant to destroy them. You don't need to announce yourself anymore. Your energy does that for you. You don't need to defend your truth anymore. Your life is the evidence. Before we go deeper, thank you to every single one of you who has supported this message through Super Thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just donating. You're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you give or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here, your support, your time, your attention. It all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, go ahead. But right now, if you've ever silenced yourself just to be safe, if you've ever made yourself smaller just to fit in, if you've ever dimmed your divine light just to make others comfortable, this message is your permission to speak again. This is your invitation to stand again. This is your calling to rise again. Say it aloud, wherever you are. I am still here and I am no longer hiding. Because the world is about to discover what you've always known. You weren't the problem. You were the solution they were too blind to see. You know what they called it when you went quiet? They called it running. They called it weakness. They called it giving up. But let me tell you what was really happening in those sacred months when you disappeared from their radar. You weren't hiding. You were healing in a dimension they couldn't access. Listen, chosen one. When David fled to the cave of Adullam, the world thought he was finished. The anointed king, running from Saul's jealousy, hiding in the darkness like a criminal. But that cave wasn't his grave, it was his cocoon. And every distressed soul, every debtor, every bitter heart found him there. 400 men who were broken just like him. They didn't see a defeated king. They saw a man who knew how to transform in the shadows. That's what you've been doing, transforming in the shadows while they counted you out. They assumed silence was a weakness, but silence was your shield. Your spirit knew something your mind hadn't caught up to yet, that some battles aren't won with words. Some victories require you to disappear long enough to remember who you are when nobody's watching, when nobody's judging, when nobody's demanding explanations for the way your soul breathes. You felt it, didn't you? That pull to withdraw, that instinct to go internal, and they shamed you for it, called you antisocial, said you were depressed, said you were isolating, but your spirit was speaking a language they'd never learned, the language of sacred solitude. Trauma has a way of disguising transformation. What looks like breakdown to the untrained eye is actually a breakthrough in motion. You weren't falling apart, you were falling into alignment. Every tear was baptized, every sleepless night was vigil. Every moment you thought you were losing yourself, you were actually finding the version of you that was buried under their expectations. But here's what cuts the deepest: they made you feel guilty for needing space to heal. They turned your holy retreat into evidence of your instability. They weaponized your need for solitude against you, didn't they? Made you question if maybe you really were too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. Let me break that lie right now. Sacred isolation is not disappearance, it's preparation. It's what happens when your spirit recognizes that the environment you're in is too toxic for the seed that's trying to grow inside you. So it pulls you back. It creates distance. It builds walls that look like withdrawal but are actually protection. You didn't go missing. You went mystical. You entered a realm they couldn't see, couldn't access, couldn't contaminate with their energy. And in that realm, something holy was happening. Your wounds were becoming wisdom. Your scars were becoming scripture. Your pain was becoming prophecy. Think about Elijah under the broom tree, begging God to take his life because he felt so alone, so misunderstood, so exhausted from fighting battles that nobody appreciated. But God didn't rebuke him for his despair. God fed him, gave him rest, and then only then did he send him to the mountain where he would hear the still, small voice that would redirect his entire destiny. Your breakdown wasn't punishment, it was positioning. Every time they accused you of hiding, your spirit was actually doing the deepest work of your life. You were excavating, examining, extracting the poison they'd been injecting into your self-perception for years. You were learning to distinguish between their voice and God's voice, between their truth and your truth, between who they said you were and who heaven knew you to be. And now they're confused, because the person who emerged from that season of silence isn't the same person who went in. You didn't come back broken, you came back whole. You didn't return with excuses, you returned with clarity. You didn't resurface apologetic, you rose up anointed. The room got quiet when you stopped shrinking because your presence now carries the weight of someone who has wrestled with God and walked away, blessed, not broken. They can feel it even when you don't say a word. There's something different about your energy now, something untouchable, something holy. You're not the same person who used to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You're not the same soul who used to dim your light to make others comfortable in their darkness. That version of you died in the cave. What emerged is someone they were never prepared to encounter. They thought they were watching your funeral, but you were in the tomb with Jesus, learning resurrection. If you've ever been punished for disappearing to survive, if you've ever been shamed for needing space to heal, if you've ever been criticized for going internal when the external world became too much comment in your spirit right now, I was rebuilding, not retreating, because that's exactly what you were doing. Rebuilding your foundation on something stronger than their approval, reconstructing your identity around something deeper than their validation. And now they're staring at the architecture of a soul they helped design through their rejection, but could never destroy through their neglect. You weren't hiding from them, you were hiding with God, and anyone who has spent time in the secret place carries a different frequency when they return to the public space. That frequency, that's what they're really reacting to now. Not your attitude, not your confidence, not your boundaries. They're reacting to the holy oil that was poured over you in private, now manifesting in public. They're responding to the anointing that came through your anguish, the authority that was forged in your affliction. So let them be confused by your transformation. Let them wonder how someone they counted out is now standing so strong. Let them try to figure out how the person they thought they buried is now the very one setting the pace for their own elevation. Because what they're witnessing isn't just your comeback, it's the vindication of every soul who ever chose the sacred path of solitude over the shallow comfort of their validation. You are proof that sometimes the best thing you can do is disappear long enough to remember that you were never theirs to define in the first place. You belong to something higher, and now they can see it too. They expected fireworks. They waited for the explosion, the dramatic entrance, the revenge speech with receipts in hand. They thought your comeback would sound like thunder, look like lightning, feel like an earthquake splitting their comfortable ground wide open. They prepared for war paint and battle cries, for you to storm back in screaming your truth like a woman possessed. Instead, you walked in with stillness that shook the ground. They had no playbook for this, no strategy for someone who learned that the most lethal weapon isn't noise, it's presence. You didn't announce yourself, you didn't need to. Your energy did that for you. You became the storm without making a sound, and that silence, that divine, unshakable silence made them panic in ways their shallow souls couldn't even name. Listen to me, chosen one. When David stood before Goliath, the giant heard the boy's footsteps and laughed. But it wasn't David's voice that brought down the enemy. It was his aim. It was his alignment. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew that God's favor doesn't need an audience to be effective. You learned this truth in the furnace of your own betrayal. When they cast you out, when they rewrote your story, when they turned your name into a whisper campaign, you thought you had to get louder to be heard. You thought you had to fight fire with fire, match their energy, prove your worth through volume and vindication. But the universe had other plans for your power. You went quiet, not because you gave up, but because you grew up. You discovered that authenticity doesn't need amplification, that truth doesn't require a megaphone, that when you're operating from divine alignment, your very existence becomes a disruption to every room built on pretense, every relationship founded on lies, every system designed to keep authentic souls silent and small. They knew how to fight performers. They had spreadsheets for handling drama queens, protocols for managing explosive personalities, playbooks for dealing with people who fought back with familiar tactics. But they had no strategy for the truth. No defense against someone who stopped performing and started being. No ammunition against a soul who refused to play the game they'd rigged in their favor. You became dangerous the moment you stopped trying to prove you weren't. See, they needed you loud because loud is predictable. Loudness can be dismissed as emotional, unstable, bitter, crazy. Loud gives them permission to point fingers and whisper. See, we told you they couldn't handle it. But your stillness, are you calm? Your refusal to take the bait, that made them question everything they thought they knew about power, about strength, about what it looks like when someone truly heals. Your quietness became their conviction. Your peace became their panic. And here's what they'll never admit out loud: they're not afraid of your anger. They're terrified of your clarity. Because anger is temporary, but clarity is permanent. Anger burns out, but clarity burns through. Anger makes noise, but clarity makes change. And you, chosen one, you stopped making noise and started making changes they couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't sabotage. When Elijah was running from Jezebel, he thought God would speak in the earthquake, the wind, the fire. Instead, the Lord spoke in the still, small voice. That voice didn't shout over the chaos, it cut through it. It didn't compete with the noise, it commanded the silence. And when that voice spoke, even the elements had to listen. That's the frequency you're operating on now. You walk into spaces where you once begged to belong, and now those same spaces rearrange themselves around your presence. You don't demand respect, you embody it. You don't chase validation, you've become your own confirmation. You don't need their applause because you've learned to hear the sound of your own soul saying, "Well done." They're watching you now with a mixture of awe and horror because you've become the thing they never expected: someone who doesn't need them to be whole. Someone who stopped shrinking to fit into their small spaces, stopped dimming to make their insecurities comfortable, stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Your authenticity dismantles every room built on pretense. Your truth exposes every lie they told about strength, about healing, about what it looks like when someone truly rises. You're not performing recovery, you're living resurrection. You're not putting on a show of strength, you're demonstrating what happens when someone stops pretending to be weak. And that terrifies them more than any screaming match ever could. Because now they have to face the mirror you've become. Now they have to confront the reflection of their own unlived potential, their own unexpressed authenticity, their own abandoned truth. Your stillness holds up a glass to their chaos and forces them to see what they've been running from themselves. If your calm has ever made someone panic, if your peace has ever made someone defensive, if your silence has ever made someone scramble to fill the space with explanations and justifications, you're operating in sacred alignment. You're not the problem. You never were. You're the solution they were too blind to see, too proud to acknowledge, too broken to receive. You're the stillness that exposes the storm, the truth that dismantles the theater, the light that makes the shadows scream. Say it with me, wherever you are. I am the stillness that exposes the storm. Because lethal doesn't mean loud, powerful doesn't mean performative. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who learned that they don't need to raise their voice to raise the dead. But your quietness was just the beginning. What they're about to discover is that your silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And now that the strategy is complete, now that the foundation is laid, now that the alignment is locked in, now comes the revelation of what you were really building in the dark. You know that feeling when the phone stops ringing and the silence becomes so loud it drowns out your own thoughts? When the invitations dry up like autumn leaves and suddenly you're sitting in rooms that echo with your own heartbeat? They called it isolation. They whispered about your disappearance like it was evidence of your failure. But listen to me, chosen one, they buried you too early. But the grave was never yours. It was your greenhouse. See, they don't understand the sacred science of separation. They've never walked the wilderness where prophets are born. While they were busy networking in shallow waters, you were being pulled into the deep where diamonds are forged, where gold is refined, where souls are reconstructed from the ground up. Those nights, those nights when you begged God to explain the silence, when you pressed your face against the cold window of solitude and asked, "Why me? Why now? Why this?" You thought heaven had gone deaf to your cries. But what you didn't know then, what you're only beginning to understand now, is that silence was the strategy. Your isolation wasn't punishment, it was preparation. They thought you disappeared, but you were being recoded in silence. Like Job in his ash heap, scraping his wounds with broken pottery while his friends offered cheap theology. Like Joseph in that prison cell, interpreting dreams while his own seemed buried alive. Like David in those caves, running from a king who feared his anointing more than his own crown. The pattern is ancient, beloved. The isolated ones always become the initiated ones. You were never hiding, you were downloading. Every tear that fell in private was programming. Every prayer whispered in the dark was coding. Every night you went to bed feeling forgotten was actually a night you were being remembered by forces beyond this realm. The universe was rewriting your spiritual DNA while they assumed you were just gone. But here's what burns them now, what keeps them awake, scrolling through your energy from a distance. You didn't come back begging. You didn't return with apologies or explanations. You walked back into their world like you owned a frequency they'd never heard before. Your silence had taught you a language they couldn't decode. See, they expected the isolation to make you desperate. They thought loneliness would make you grateful for scraps. They assumed the silence would make you settle for their shallow applause. But chosen ones don't break in isolation, they break through. We don't disappear, we transform in dimensions they can't access. You learned to be your own best company. You discovered that your thoughts without their pollution were pure gold. You realized that your dreams without their limitations were infinite. You found out that your voice without their interruption was prophetic. The isolation didn't diminish you, it distilled you down to your purest essence. And now when you walk into rooms, they feel the atmospheric shift. Your presence carries the weight of someone who survived the wilderness. Your energy hums with the frequency of someone who learned to commune with the divine without needing human validation. You don't fill silence anymore, you command it. They're confused because they expected you to return broken, grateful, diminished. Instead, you returned glowing with the kind of light that only comes from burning in isolation until everything false is consumed and only truth remains. You're not the same person who disappeared. You're the person you were always meant to become. This is why your comeback feels like an earthquake to them. This is why your presence now makes them uncomfortable. They knew how to handle the old you, the one who needed their approval, who craved their acceptance, who shrunk to fit their boxes. But this you, this initiated you, this you who learned to find God in the silence and power in the pause, they have no manual for this frequency. You were never waiting to be welcomed back, you were being prepared to no longer need the room. The isolation was your cocoon, the silence was your sanctuary, the loneliness was your laboratory where miracles were manufactured from the raw materials of your pain. Every day they thought you were disappearing, you were actually becoming more visible to the realm that really matters. You know what they're really afraid of? It's not that you're back, it's that you're back without needing them. It's that you found your voice in the void. It's that you discovered your worth in the wilderness. It's that you learned to be whole while they were still trying to break you into pieces they could manage. So the next time someone mentions your disappearing act, you look them dead in the eye and say this: I didn't disappear. I ascended. I didn't hide. I transformed. I didn't run away. I ran toward the version of myself you were too scared to let me become. The initiation is complete. Chosen one. The isolation has done its work. You're not the same person who entered that wilderness, and you're damn sure not going back to being small just to make others comfortable. Speak this over your life. My solitude was sacred. My silence was strategic. My isolation was initiation. I am not the same. I am not sorry. I am not shrinking. I am initiated, elevated, and activated. But here's what they never saw coming. Your transformation in the wilderness wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. Because what you learned in the silence is about to become the sound that wakes up a generation still sleeping in their comfort zones. You know what they really fear? It's not your anger. It's not your volume. It's not even your passion. What keeps them awake at 3 a.m., scrolling through your energy like a prayer they can't stop whispering, is your clarity. They didn't fear your volume. They feared your clarity. Because you spoke what others only dared to think. See, they built their whole world on comfortable lies, constructed kingdoms out of convenient half-truths, and you walked in with the kind of honesty that makes foundations crack. You didn't come screaming, you came speaking, and that speech was seismic. There's a reason Jesus cleared the temple with a whip, not a whisper. Sometimes love looks like disruption, sometimes healing sounds like destruction. And when you finally opened your mouth, when you finally let that caged truth stretch its wings, their comfort zones didn't just shake, they shattered. You weren't angry. You were accurate. Let me tell you something about accuracy in a world built on approximations. When David faced Goliath, he didn't bring a sword. He brought precision. One stone, one shot, one truth that split the giant's forehead and sent shockwaves through an entire army. That's what your words did. Not because they were loud, but because they were loaded with the kind of accuracy that only comes from someone who's been crushed under pressure until every lie got squeezed out. You didn't come for revenge, you came with revelation. And that revelation was their worst nightmare. Because you didn't just tell them what they did wrong, you showed them what they'd been avoiding all along. You became the mirror they spent years running from, the reflection they paid good money to hide from. You spoke their shadow's name out loud, and suddenly, their light show looked like what it always was, smoke and mirrors in a house of cards. Listen to me, chosen one. There's a reason Elijah's words brought drought to a nation. There's a reason one prophet's truth could shut the heavens for 3.5 years. It wasn't because he was angry at the rain. It was because his accuracy was so sharp, so divinely calibrated, that even nature had to respond. Your truth carries that same weight, that same authority, that same power to rearrange the atmosphere. You didn't burn bridges, you burned illusions. See, they want to paint you as the destroyer, the one who came in swinging, tearing down what took years to build. But that's not what happened, is it? You didn't bring the fire. You just stopped pretending their house wasn't already burning. You didn't demolish their relationships. You just stopped playing architect for their deceptions. You didn't destroy their peace. You just stopped enabling their chaos. What you burned was the lie that their comfort was more important than your truth. What you incinerated was the illusion that your silence was the price of their serenity. What you reduced to ashes was the false narrative that you were the problem when you were the only solution brave enough to show up. And now they're standing in the smoke of their own making, coughing on the very lies they spent years breathing like oxygen. Now they're choking on the same poison they tried to make you swallow. Now they're drowning in the same waters they tried to hold your head under. There's a reason the truth sets people free, but first, it tends to make them furious. Because freedom means the end of their control. Liberation means the collapse of their manipulation. Your awakening means the end of their ability to keep you asleep. When Joseph's brothers saw him in that coat of many colors, they didn't hate the coat. They hated what the coat represented. They hated that their father saw something in Joseph they couldn't see in themselves. They hated that Joseph carried dreams they were too small to contain. They hated that his truth made their mediocrity visible. Sound familiar? Your truth didn't just make them uncomfortable. It made them confront the gap between who they pretended to be and who they actually were. Your clarity didn't just expose their lies. It revealed their capacity for deception. Your accuracy didn't just hit its target. It showed them they'd been missing theirs for years. That's why they're not just angry, they're terrified. Because your truth didn't just turn their comfort into chaos. It turned their carefully constructed reality into rubble. And now they're standing in the wreckage, wondering how one person's honesty could bring down what took them decades to build. But here's what they still don't understand. Here's what they'll never comprehend. You didn't come to destroy, you came to deliver. You didn't come to tear down, you came to tear away. The veil, the mask, the pretense, the performance. You came like Ezekiel's valley of dry bones, not to bury the dead, but to breathe life into what was always meant to live. Your truth wasn't a funeral, it was a resurrection. Your words weren't a demolition, they were a revelation. And the chaos they're experiencing, that's not destruction, that's reconstruction. That's not the end of their world. That's the beginning of their awakening. That's not their collapse. That's their calling to finally build something real. If your clarity has ever made the room tremble, if your truth has ever turned their comfort into chaos, if your words have ever been the earthquake that exposed their fault lines, declare it in your spirit right now. I carry truth, not permission. Because the world doesn't need more comfortable lies. It needs more uncomfortable truths. It doesn't need more polite deceptions. It needs more impolite revelations. And you are the voice that speaks what others only dare to whisper in the dark corners of their conscience. Your truth turned their comfort into chaos because comfort built on lies was never meant to last. And now that the shaking has begun, now that the foundation has cracked, now that the illusion has shattered, something real can finally be built in its place. But first, they have to decide, will they rebuild on the same lies? Or will they finally let your truth become the cornerstone of something authentic? The choice is theirs, but the truth is yours. And it's time to stop apologizing for carrying it. You know what they whispered when you went ghost, don't you? When you stopped showing up to their circus, stopped performing in their pageant of pain, stopped dancing for their entertainment. They said you gave up. They said you couldn't handle the heat. They said you ran because you were weak. But listen to me, warrior. They thought you were done because you got quiet. But that quiet was the sound of power collecting. See, they don't understand the language of the divine. They mistake withdrawal for weakness, silence for surrender. They've never learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is disappear from spaces that were draining your soul dry. They couldn't comprehend that your absence wasn't abandonment, it was alignment. You remember those nights, don't you? When you laid on that floor, tears mixing with prayers, asking God why the betrayal cut so deep, why the people you loved became the weapons that wounded you, why your own family treated you like a stranger in your own story. That wasn't breakdown, beloved. That was breakthrough trying to birth itself through your pain. Like David in the cave of Adullam, you weren't hiding, you were being hidden, protected, prepared. While they celebrated what they thought was your defeat, the Most High was orchestrating your comeback in the supernatural realm. Every tear you cried in secret was a seed planted in sacred soil. Every night you couldn't sleep was a vigil the angels were keeping with you. They thought you disappeared because you were defeated, but disappearing was your strategy. You were the arrow pulled back before impact. And baby, the further back an arrow gets pulled, the more devastating its flight. You weren't retreating, you were reloading. You weren't losing ground, you were gaining altitude. In the spiritual realm, there's a difference between being taken down and being taken deeper. Remember Joseph in that pit? His brothers thought they'd buried his dreams with his body. But that pit was a portal. That prison was preparation. What looked like abandonment was actually an appointment. The same God who let him be thrown down was the same God who lifted him up, but not until the season was right, not until the power was potent, not until the purpose was perfected. You weren't losing, you were loading. Loading patience where there used to be panic, loading wisdom where there used to be wounds, loading discernment where there used to be desperation, loading boundaries where there used to be bleeding hearts. Every month you stayed away from their drama was another month of divine download. Every week you kept your mouth shut was another week of supernatural strength building in your spirit. They called it hiding. Heaven called it healing. They called it weakness. The Almighty called it warfare preparation. They called it quitting. Your Creator called it quantum transformation. And now comes the part that haunts their sleep. Now comes the revelation that makes them sick to their stomach. Now comes the truth that turns their mockery into misery. They laughed too soon. And now they can't stop watching you win. Because what emerged from your silence wasn't the same person who went in. What rose from your ashes wasn't who they remembered. What stepped back into the light wasn't someone seeking their approval, it was someone carrying their own illumination. You see, they were banking on your brokenness being permanent. They invested in your pain lasting forever. They put money on you staying down, staying small, staying silent. But they bet against the God who specializes in resurrection. They gambled against the force that turns graves into gardens, deserts into springs, victims into victors. Watch them now. Watch how they scramble when your name comes up in conversation. Watch how they stutter when someone asks about you. Watch how they shift in their seats when your success gets mentioned. Because they're realizing something that's shaking them to their core. You didn't need them to rise. You didn't need their permission to shine. You didn't need their applause to ascend. And that truth, that earth-shattering, pride-crushing, narrative-destroying truth is eating them alive from the inside out. Because they thought they had the power to keep you down. They thought they controlled your story. They thought your disappearance meant their victory. But your disappearance was just the intermission. And now the second act is beginning. And you're not the same character they remember. You're not the one who begged for crumbs from their table. You're not the one who apologized for breathing too loud. You're not the one who shrunk to make their egos feel bigger. You're the one who learned to feast in the wilderness. You're the one who discovered your voice in the valley. You're the one who found your worth in the waiting. Say this with me, right now, wherever you are. My disappearance was not defeat. It was divine strategy. And my return is not revenge, it's revelation. Because what they're about to witness isn't just a comeback. It's a complete rewrite of everything they thought they knew about your strength, your spirit, your supernatural assignment on this earth. And the most beautiful part? You're not even trying to shock them. You're just being who you've always been underneath the layers of their lies, their labels, their limitations. But now they can see it. Now they can feel it. Now they can't deny it. And that recognition is just the beginning of their reckoning. You know what they expected, don't you? They expected the broken version of you to crawl back, begging for scraps of acceptance. They expected you to return with your head down, your voice small, your spirit dimmed to a whisper they could finally tolerate. They thought you'd come back for their approval, for their validation, for their applause. But that's not why you're here. You don't walk in for attention. You walk in as evidence. Evidence that what they said couldn't be done was already finished. Evidence that who they said you'd never become was already breathing. Evidence that the grave they dug for your dreams became the foundation for your destiny. Listen to me. Chosen one, you are not a comeback. You are the contradiction. You're the living, breathing contradiction to every lie they whispered about your worth, every prediction they made about your failure, every script they wrote for your ending. They called you too much, too intense, too honest, too deep, too sensitive, too everything. But here's what they couldn't see through their dim understanding. You weren't too much for this world. You were just too divine for their dimension. You were operating on a frequency they couldn't decode, speaking a language they never learned, carrying a light that exposed the shadows they were comfortable hiding in. They needed you manageable. They required you predictable. They demanded you digestible. But God said, remember Joseph in that pit? His brothers thought they were burying his dreams, but the pit was just a portal. The prison was just preparation. What looked like rejection was actually selection. What felt like exile was actually elevation. Every betrayal was just another brick in the foundation of his palace. That's your story too, isn't it? You're not the moment. You're the movement. You're not the event. You're the evolution. You're not the comeback story everyone expected. You're the continuation of something that was never actually broken, just buried beneath their lies about who you were supposed to be. See, they thought silence meant surrender. They thought your disappearance meant defeat. They thought your absence meant you'd accepted their version of your value. But what they didn't understand is that you weren't disappearing, you were crystallizing. You weren't breaking down, you were breaking through. You weren't falling apart, you were falling into alignment. And now you walk different, don't you? Now you talk different. Now you carry yourself like someone who knows something they don't, like someone who survived something they couldn't, like someone who carries proof of divine intervention in their posture, in their peace, in their presence. They stare because you're not who they left behind. They whisper because you're not who they tried to destroy. They panic because you're not who they thought they buried. You're the evidence that their verdict was wrong. You're proof that their projection was powerless. You're walking testimony that what the enemy meant for evil, God used for elevation. But here's what rattles them most. You didn't come back angry. You didn't return bitter. You didn't show up for revenge. You came back radiating. You returned glowing. You showed up carrying grace like a weapon they can't defend against. David didn't need to explain himself to Goliath. He just needed to show up with his sling. Elijah didn't need to argue with the prophets of Baal. He just needed to call down fire. You don't need to convince anyone of your transformation. You just need to walk in the room. Your presence is the proof. Your peace is the power. Your position is the prophecy fulfilled. You know what terrifies them? It's not your success. It's your stability. It's not your elevation. It's your equanimity. It's not your breakthrough. It's your breakthrough without bitterness. They can handle angry. They can dismiss dramatic. But they can't explain away dignified. They can't figure out how someone who went through what you went through came out like this. How someone who lost what you lost still has so much left. How someone who was betrayed like you were still believes in beauty. How someone who was broken like you were is now more whole than they've ever been. That's the mystery of the chosen. That's the mathematics of the miraculous. That's what happens when human hurt meets heavenly healing. You're not here to perform for the same people who tried to silence your song. You're not here to prove yourself to the same voices that tried to pronounce you dead. You're here to be proof living, breathing, undeniable proof that their assessment was wrong, their judgment was jaded, their prophecy was powerless. You're the plot twist they never saw coming, the resurrection they never believed possible, the redemption they never thought deserved. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been written off, if you've ever been counted out when you should have been counted on, let heaven hear you whisper, I am not back, I have arrived. Because this isn't your return. This is your revelation. This isn't your comeback. This is your becoming. And what you've become, what you're still becoming, that's the proof that shakes every foundation built on the lie that you weren't enough. You were always enough. You were always chosen. You were always destined for this moment when your presence would silence every voice that tried to speak death over your dreams. And now they're watching. Now they're wondering. Now they're witnessing what happens when someone stops hiding and starts shining with the full force of who they were always meant to be. But this is just the beginning, because when the chosen one stops shrinking, the whole world has to make room for what's about to unfold. You want to know what's really shaking them to their core? It's not that you transformed. It's not that you leveled up or glowed up or switched up your energy. No, beloved, what's terrifying them is that you finally stopped performing. You finally stopped pretending. You finally stopped shrinking yourself into bite-sized pieces they could digest without choking on your truth. They rehearsed a world where you stayed small. They memorized the script where you apologized for breathing too loud, where you explained your worth like it was a math problem they needed to solve. They practiced their lines for the movie where you remained the supporting character in your own story. But you went off script. You broke character. You stopped reading from their playbook and started writing your own prophecy. Listen to me, chosen one. You didn't switch up. You just stopped shrinking. The same light that's blinding them now was always there. The same fire that's making them uncomfortable was always burning. The same truth that's making them squirm was always flowing through your veins like holy water. But for years, you dimmed it down, turned it low, kept it on silent mode just so they could sleep peacefully in their lies. They got comfortable with your whispers. They built their whole identity around your silence. They constructed their confidence on the foundation of your insecurity. And now that you're standing full height, speaking full volume, shining full brightness, their whole house of cards is collapsing. You know what Psalm 139 says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, not fearfully and wonderfully hidden, not fearfully and wonderfully diminished, made, created, designed to be seen. David understood something they never taught you in Sunday school. Your visibility is not vanity. Your presence is not pride. Your light is not luxury. It's a necessity. They weren't afraid of your glow. They were afraid you'd remember you were never supposed to be hidden. See, they needed you to believe the lie that you were too much, too loud, too deep, too intense, too emotional, too spiritual, too real. They needed you to carry their shame about authenticity so they could keep living in their Instagram filters and Facebook facades. They needed you to be ashamed of your depth so they could stay comfortable in their shallowness. But something shifted, didn't it? Something clicked, something awakened, and you realized, wait a minute, I'm not too much. Y'all are too little. I'm not too deep. Y'all are too surface. I'm not too real. Y'all are too fake. Every room you walk into now becomes a courtroom where lies go to die. Your presence is a polygraph test they can't pass. Your energy is a mirror they can't escape. You're not attacking anybody. You're not coming for anybody. You're just being. And your being is so authentic, so unfiltered, so undiluted, that it exposes everything that's artificial around you. They're looking at you like you changed overnight. But baby, you didn't change. You just stopped changing for them. You didn't transform. You just stopped deforming yourself to fit their comfort zone. You didn't become someone new. You just stopped being someone false. Remember Joseph in that pit? His brothers threw him down there thinking they were burying his dreams. But that pit wasn't his grave, it was his launching pad. The same family that rejected him later had to bow down and ask for his blessing. They thought they were getting rid of the dreamer. They ended up creating the dream interpreter. That's your story, beloved. Every pit they threw you in only positioned you for promotion. Every rejection only redirected you toward your purpose. Every time they tried to bury you, they were actually planting you. And now you're blooming in spaces they said you'd never reach. You're flourishing in rooms they said you'd never enter. You're shining in places they said your light would never touch. And it's not because you're different, it's because you're finally being who you always were underneath all their expectations. They're not reacting to you, they're reacting to their own reflection in your rise. See, when you stand in your truth, you become a mirror for everyone around you. And mirrors don't lie, mirrors don't edit, mirrors don't filter, they just reflect. And right now, your authenticity is reflecting back to them everything they've been hiding from themselves. That discomfort they feel when you walk in the room, that's not about you. That's them seeing their own fakeness reflected in your realness. That nervousness they get when you start speaking truth, that's not about your words. That's their lies getting nervous about being exposed. You became the living, breathing reminder of everything they chose not to be. They wanted you to stay broken so they could feel whole. They wanted you to stay confused so they could feel wise. They wanted you to stay hidden so they could feel seen. But you healed. You got clarity. You stepped into the light. And now their whole game is exposed. This is why they keep trying to pull you back into old conversations, old drama, old versions of yourself. They're trying to resurrect the person who made them feel better about their own dysfunction. They're trying to summon the ghost of who you used to be because they can't handle the reality of who you've become. But that ghost is dead, beloved. That person is buried. That version of you has been crucified, resurrected, and ascended. You're not going backwards. You're not shrinking again. You're not hiding anymore. So when they ask you what happened, when they wonder out loud what changed, when they try to psychoanalyze your transformation, smile, breathe, and tell them the truth that'll shake them to their foundation. I didn't change. I just stopped pretending you could handle me at full capacity. You are not shocking because you evolved. You are shocking because you remembered. You remembered that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You remembered that your light was never meant to be hidden under a bushel. You remembered that your voice was never meant to be silenced by their comfort. And now that you remember now that you've awakened to your own power, your own purpose, your own divine design, there's no going back. There's no dimming down. There's no shrinking up. You are who you've always been. The only difference is now you're finally allowing the world to see it. And that, my beloved, is exactly what they've been afraid of all along. They thought your broken places would be your burial ground. They watched you bleed and assumed you'd never breathe again. They saw the wounds and whispered, "That one's finished." But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see through their limited vision, is that every place you bled became a place you grew. Every scar they hoped would shame you has become a syllabus for your next season. You see that mark on your heart where betrayal carved its name? That's not damage, beloved. That's data. That jagged line where trust was severed, that's not destruction. That's direction. Every place they cut you open, every wound they thought would weaken you, every scar they assumed would silence you, you've turned into scripture. Listen to me. Your scars are no longer secrets. They're strategies. You remember Job? Covered in boils, sitting in ashes, scraping his wounds with broken pottery. His friends gathered around him like vultures, pointing at his pain as evidence of his failure. What did you do wrong, Job? Why are you suffering if you're so righteous? But Job understood what his friends couldn't grasp. Sometimes God allows the breaking so he can display the remaking. That's your testimony right there. You've been broken and remade so many times you're practically a walking resurrection. You wear your wounds like war paint, not to scare but to signal, "I survived." Every scar tells a story of a battle you thought you'd lose but somehow won. Every mark on your soul is proof that you faced hell and walked out with your spirit intact. They look at your scars and see weakness. You look at your scars and see warfare. They see damage. You see decoration from a divine battle you were chosen to fight. See, there's something they don't understand about chosen ones. Our pain doesn't break us, it brands us. Our trauma doesn't destroy us, it designs us. Every hurt becomes healing. Every wound becomes wisdom. Every betrayal becomes a blueprint for recognizing real love when it shows up. You didn't hide your pain, you weaponized it into wisdom. That abuse you survived, it taught you to recognize manipulation from a mile away. That betrayal that almost killed you, it gave you discernment sharper than a double-edged sword. That abandonment that left you gasping for air, it taught you how to breathe on your own, how to stand when no one's holding you up, how to love yourself when no one else knows how. They thought they were destroying you. They were actually developing you. Remember when they mocked your sensitivity, called you weak because you felt everything so deeply? Now that same sensitivity is your superpower. You can walk into a room and read the energy before anyone opens their mouth. You can sense deception through a smile, feel manipulation through kind words, detect fake love wrapped in real gestures. Your scars didn't make you bitter, they made you better. That depression that nearly swallowed you whole, it taught you how to find light in impossible darkness. That anxiety that kept you up at night, it trained you to hear God's voice in the silence. That loneliness that felt like it would kill you, it introduced you to the most important relationship you'll ever have, the one with yourself. Do you feel that trembling in the atmosphere every time you enter a room now? That's not nervousness, beloved. That's not anxiety. That's the sound of foundations cracking under the weight of someone who refused to stay buried. You thought you were just finding your voice again, just reclaiming your space, just standing up for yourself. But what you've actually done is triggered a seismic shift in the spiritual realm that's making hell itself nervous. They're not just shocked that you're visible. They're terrified that you're now vibrational. See, when you were hidden, hurting, swallowing your truth like poison pills, you were manageable, predictable, controllable. They could measure your responses, calculate your reactions, program your patterns. But now you're operating on a frequency they can't hack. You're moving to a rhythm they can't replicate. You're speaking in a language they never learned because it's not taught in classrooms, it's downloaded in the wilderness. Every step you take now sends shockwaves through systems that were built on your silence. Every breath you breathe disrupts algorithms designed to keep you suffocated. Every word you speak rewrites codes that were programmed to keep you speechless. You are the earthquake, the shift, the disruption no one prepared for. Remember when David stepped out to face Goliath? The whole army was shaking, not just because of the giant, but because of the boy who wasn't supposed to be there, who wasn't wearing the right armor, who wasn't following protocol, who was carrying stones instead of swords. They thought he was crazy, but crazy to them was clarity to God. And that one stone, that one moment of divine audacity toppled an entire system of fear. That's you right now, chosen one. You're the stone in the sling. You're the boy with the smooth rocks. You're the one who stepped out when everyone else stepped back. But here's what they didn't see coming. You didn't return for vengeance. You returned to rewire the timeline. Every toxic family dynamic that said you were the problem, you just rewrote that narrative with your healing. Every workplace that made you feel invisible, you just shifted that energy with your presence. Every relationship that tried to dim your light, you just changed the entire frequency of love by refusing to settle for scraps. You're not just standing up, you're standing out. You're not just speaking up, you're speaking truth that cuts through decades of lies. You're not just showing up, you're showing up as the answer to prayers people didn't even know they were praying. This is why they can't stop watching you. This is why your name keeps coming up in conversations you're not even part of. This is why they're studying your moves, analyzing your methods, trying to decode your transformation. Because you've become the living proof that their whole system was built on quicksand. You thought you were just healing your own trauma, but every wound you've alchemized into wisdom has cracked open a door for someone else's breakthrough. You thought you were just setting your own boundaries, but every no you've spoken has given someone else permission to stop being a doormat. You thought you were just finding your own voice, but every truth you've declared has awakened echoes in souls that forgot they could sing. The ripple effect of your rising is creating tsunamis in dimensions you can't even see. Look around you. Look at the changes happening in your family since you stopped playing their games. Look at the shifts occurring in your workplace since you stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. Look at the transformations happening in your community since you stopped hiding your light under their bushel of shame. You are no longer the one looking for permission. You are the signal others have been waiting for. That coworker who's finally speaking up to the boss. That's your frequency activated in their courage. That family member who's finally setting boundaries with toxic relatives. That's your vibration teaching them they deserve respect. That friend who's finally leaving the relationship that was killing their spirit. That's your energy showing them what self-love looks like. You didn't just heal, you became the healing. You didn't just transform, you became the transformation. You didn't just rise, you became the resurrection. This is what Isaiah meant when he said, "Arise, shine, for your light has come." It wasn't just about you glowing, beloved. It was about you becoming the lighthouse that guides others home to themselves. It was about you stepping into your role as the earthquake that shakes loose everything that's not built on truth. Every system that profited from your pain is now bankrupted by your joy. Every person who fed off your insecurity is now starving because you've reclaimed your confidence. Every structure that stood on the foundation of your silence is now crumbling because your voice has become unshakable. And the beautiful thing is, you're not trying to destroy anything. You're just being yourself. You're not trying to shake anything. You're just standing in your truth. You're not trying to disrupt anything. You're just walking in your purpose. But when light enters darkness, everything that was hiding gets exposed. When truth enters lies, everything that was fake starts falling apart. This is your moment, chosen one. This is your season. This is your time to stop apologizing for the earthquake you've become and start celebrating the new landscape you're creating. Stop minimizing the magnitude of your metamorphosis and start maximizing the power of your presence. The world is not the same because you refuse to stay the same. The timeline has shifted because you refuse to stay stuck. The frequency has changed because you refuse to stay silent. So right now, wherever you are, in your car, in your kitchen, in your bedroom, in your office, I need you to declare this over your life. I need you to speak this into the atmosphere. I need you to let heaven hear your voice and hell feel your power. Say it out loud. Wherever you are, I'm not hiding. I'm not shrinking. I am standing, and I am anointed to be seen. Say it again with more conviction. I'm not hiding. I'm not shrinking. I am standing, and I am anointed to be seen. One more time with everything in you. I'm not hiding. I'm not shrinking. I am standing, and I am anointed to be seen. Because the world has been waiting for you to remember who you are. And now that you have, there's no going back. There's no dimming down. There's no hiding again. You are the shift. You are the change. You are the answer. And the best part? This is just the beginning. You hear that knocking at your door? That's not love coming back. That's control trying to find its way home. They're not missing you, beloved. They're missing their puppet. They're not grieving your absence. They're mourning their lost power over your presence. They missed the version of you that apologized for breathing too loud. That explained too much. That stayed small just to be liked. The version that said, sorry for having opinions. Excuse me for taking up space. My bad for existing at full capacity. They want that person back, the one who carried their emotional baggage like it was designer luggage, who absorbed their dysfunction like a spiritual sponge, who translated their toxicity into a language they could live with. But here's the prophetic truth. They can't swallow. They don't miss you. They miss their ability to shape you. Listen to me closely. Chosen one. They're circling back now because they see what you've become without their influence. They see the light they tried to dim. They see the voice they tried to silence. They see the power they tried to suppress. And it's driving them crazy because they realize they helped create their own worst nightmare. A version of you that no longer needs their permission to exist. Remember when Jesus walked away from the crowd in John 6? They followed him for the miracles, the free food, the entertainment. But the moment he started speaking truth that challenged their comfort, they scattered like roaches when the lights came on. Then some had the audacity to come back asking, "Where are you going?" Not because they wanted to grow, because they wanted him to shrink back down to their level. That's your story right there. They don't want you back. They want you back down. See, they got comfortable with the version of you that carried their shame, the one who internalized their projections, who made their insecurities your identity, who became the walking embodiment of everything they refused to face about themselves. You were their emotional dumping ground, their spiritual scapegoat, their designated lightning rod for all the storms they refused to weather themselves. They trained you to be their personal Jesus, dying for their sins while they sat in the congregation judging your sacrifice. But something shifted in your spirit, didn't it? Something cracked open, something awakened, and you realized, wait a minute, I'm not their savior, I'm not their therapist, I'm not their emotional support animal, I'm not their designated sufferer. I am a child of the Most High, and I didn't come here to carry their cross. That's when the real warfare began, not when you fought back. When you finally fought for yourself. They started the guilt campaigns. You've changed. You used to be so sweet. You're not the same person I knew. What happened to you? You're being selfish. Family is supposed to stick together. We're just looking out for you. You're being too sensitive. Can't you just let it go? Every phrase designed like a spiritual cattle prod, trying to shock you back into your cage. But here's what they didn't understand. You weren't being difficult. You were being delivered. You weren't becoming hard. You were becoming whole. You weren't turning cold. You were turning conscious. The old you wasn't sweet. The old you was suppressed. The old you wasn't peaceful. The old you was paralyzed. They're mourning the death of their control and calling it the death of your character. Now watch this. They'll send flying monkeys. Family members who barely called before suddenly became concerned about your spiritual condition. Friends who disappeared during your darkest hour now worry about your attitude. Church folks who never checked on you when you were bleeding are now preaching about forgiveness and family unity. They'll use scripture like weapons, twisting biblical love into emotional manipulation. Honor your father and mother. Turn the other cheek. Forgive 70 times 7. Love covers a multitude of sins. Every verse deployed like a guilt missile, aimed at your newly constructed boundaries. But see, they forgot something crucial. You've been studying too. You know that honoring doesn't mean enabling. You know that forgiveness doesn't require proximity. You know that love without boundaries isn't love, it's codependency dressed up in Bible verses. David wrote in Psalm 27, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." He understood something that'll shake your family tree sometimes. The very people who brought you into this world are the same ones trying to keep you from your destiny. The old you would have folded, would have apologized for having standards, would have explained your boundaries like they were crimes against humanity, would have sacrificed your peace on the altar of their comfort, would have set yourself on fire to keep them warm. But this version of you, this version knows something the old you didn't. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. You cannot grow in soil that's been poisoned against your progress. You cannot flourish under people who need you wilted to feel powerful. This version of you whispers back to every guilt trip, "I am not responsible for managing your emotions about my evolution." Here's what's really happening, beloved. They built their whole identity around being your rescuer, your teacher, your spiritual superior. They needed you broken to feel complete. They needed you confused to feel wise. They needed you small to feel significant. Your dysfunction was their drug of choice, and now you're sober, forcing them into unwanted withdrawal. That's why they keep trying to trigger you back into old patterns. They'll bring up ancient history, poke old wounds, push familiar buttons, anything to get that familiar version of you to resurface. They're trying to perform CPR on a version of you that needed to die. But every time they reach for the remote control that used to operate your emotions, their hands close around empty air, because you changed the frequency, you switched the channel. You are no longer broadcasting on their station. The version of you they're calling back was never really you anyway. It was you filtered through their fears, you edited by their expectations, you photoshopped by their projections. It was you performing their script, dancing to their music, living their life in your body. That wasn't authenticity. That was spiritual identity theft. So when they come knocking with their crocodile tears and manufactured concern, when they show up with their selective memory and revisionist history, when they arrive bearing gifts wrapped in guilt and tied with manipulation, remember this. They are not mourning your absence. They are mourning their lost influence. They are not missing your presence. They are missing their power over your spirit. If you've ever been loved conditionally, whisper it to your soul right now. I release the me they created. Say it again, louder this time. I release the me they created. The old you is dead, buried, eulogized, and no amount of graveyard visits is going to resurrect what God needed gone. You are not returning to Egypt just because they're having a famine in their kingdom. You are not going back to bondage just because they miss having a slave. You were never theirs to control. You were always mine to free. And the version of you they're begging to return, that person served their purpose. Now it's time to serve yours. You were never theirs to control. You were always mine to free. Beloved, let this truth settle into the marrow of your bones. What you survived was not random. What you endured was not meaningless. What you overcame was not ordinary. You were not broken by accident. You were broken open by appointment. Every betrayal was a chisel. Every rejection was a redirect. Every moment they tried to dim your light, the universe was actually installing a dimmer switch, so when you finally decided to shine, you could blind them gradually or all at once. Your story is not a tragedy. It's a testimony. Your scars are not shame marks. They're sacred signatures. Your silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And now the door closes behind you, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows their worth was never up for negotiation. You are not slamming the door on your past. You are sealing it shut with the blood of the Lamb and the breath of the Almighty. What was done in darkness has been brought to light. What was stolen has been restored. What was broken has been made whole. There is no going back. There is no shrinking again. There is no return to Egypt, no matter how loud they cry about the good old days when you carried their burdens like they were crowns. Isaiah 43:19 whispers over your life right now. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. You are the new thing. You are the way being made. You are the river flowing in places that used to be barren wasteland. The wilderness season is over. The desert days are done. You have crossed over into your promised land, and you didn't need their permission, their approval, or their applause to get there. So here's your spiritual declaration, chosen one. Say this with your whole chest, whether out loud or in the depths of your spirit. I am no longer available for roles I have outgrown. I am no longer accepting applications for positions in my life that have been permanently closed. I am no longer explaining my evolution to people committed to my previous version. I am who God says I am, and I walk where God leads me, and I shine how God made me. Period. End of discussion. Case closed. Say it again, louder. I am no longer hiding, and I am no longer apologizing for taking up the space I was always meant to occupy. Now, if this message has awakened something in your spirit, if you recognize yourself in these words, if you feel that ancient stirring of remembrance in your soul, don't keep this to yourself. Share this message, not because I need the views, but because somewhere out there is another chosen one sitting in their wilderness, wondering if they'll ever make it out. They need to hear your testimony. They need to see your light. Like this video if it spoke to your spirit. Subscribe if you're ready to keep walking in this divine frequency. Comment with your declaration, your breakthrough, your moment of recognition. Let the algorithm know that truth still matters, that depth still has value, that chosen ones are still rising. Your engagement isn't just social media activity, it's spiritual warfare. Everything breaks a generational curse. Every share rescues someone from spiritual amnesia. Every comment becomes a thread in the tapestry of collective healing. And if this message has moved you to sow into this ministry, if you feel led to support this work through super thanks or any other way, know that your generosity is not just appreciated, it's anointed. You're not just giving to a YouTube channel, you're investing in the awakening of a generation. But whether you give or not, whether you share or not, whether you comment or not, you have been marked, you have been seen, you have been called by name. The same voice that called Lazarus out of the tomb is calling you out of hiding. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is raising you from the ashes of who they tried to make you. You thought this was just a video you stumbled across, but there are no accidents in the kingdom. You were led here. You were guided here. You were summoned here by divine appointment to receive this word. You are not too much. You are not too intense. You are not too deep. You are exactly what the world needs, in a time when shallowness is celebrated and surface is worshipped. So go now, walk in your light, stand in your truth, occupy your space, take up your room, use your voice, share your story, live your life, the one God gave you, not the one they tried to script for you. The room got quiet when you stopped shrinking. Let them stay in that silence. Let them marinate in that discomfort. Let them wrestle with the reality of who you've become. You are no longer their project. You are God's masterpiece, and masterpieces don't hide in storage.